The year is 1348. Snow falls thick across the English countryside, burying the last traces of autumn. A mother kneels in the dim light of a hut, her hands trembling as she opens a clay jar sealed months ago. The smell of smoke and salt fills the air, the last of their preserved meat. Outside, the wind howls like a starving wolf. Inside, a family prays this jar will keep them alive until spring. In the medieval world, survival wasn't just a skill, it was an art. And nowhere was that art more desperate, more ingenious, than in how they fought the hunger of winter. Before supermarkets, refrigerators, and trucks full of grain, every medieval village faced the same terrifying question every year: how do we keep food from rotting before the snow melts? For peasants, winter wasn't a season, it was an enemy. If you failed to prepare, your family didn't just go hungry, they vanished into history. Through the smoke of hearth fires and the scent of salted pork, we step into that world. A place where time slowed, fear ruled, and every crumb mattered. But this isn't a story of comfort. It's a story of survival, faith, and fear. The first frost was a warning. By October, villagers knew the clock had started ticking. In the morning mist, farmers and their families worked like armies preparing for war. Not against men, but against starvation. In the fields, women gathered the last onions and cabbages, layering them carefully in pits lined with straw. Men hauled slaughtered pigs to the smokehouse, where fires burned low and steady for days, coating the meat in a blanket of smoke and salt. Every sound, the crackle of burning oak, the scrape of knives, the hiss of boiling brine, was the sound of survival. As the last geese took flight for warmer lands, the villagers knew that from now until April, the earth would give them nothing. To modern eyes, their methods might seem primitive, but in truth they were remarkably clever. A mix of chemistry, instinct, and inherited wisdom. Salt was their greatest weapon. Entire economies revolved around it. A single sack of salt could be worth a small fortune. But it could also mean the difference between life and death. Meat was rubbed, packed, and sealed in barrels of salt, sometimes for months. Fish was another staple. In coastal villages, cod and herring were caught, gutted, and dried on wooden racks by the sea wind. When the weather turned, they were stored in cool, dry lofts above the hearth, the smell of salt and smoke filling every corner. But not everyone had access to salt. Inland villages had to rely on fire. Slow, constant, consuming. Smokehouses were sacred spaces. There, meats hung from rafters like trophies, darkening over time as the smoke wrapped them in layers of flavor and preservation. The right wood mattered. Oak, beech, and apple gave each cut its scent, a smoky signature of survival. Grain was the next line of defense. Every autumn, the village threshed its harvest, storing sacks of barley, oats, and wheat inside barns raised from the damp ground. Rats were a constant threat, so cats were prized, not for companionship but for vigilance. In monasteries, cats were blessed by priests for their service in protecting the holy stores of grain. In poorer homes, grain was stored in earthen bins sealed with straw and clay. But even that wasn't safe. Moisture, mold, or a single crack in the seal could mean ruin. Entire winters were lost to one careless moment. You could survive without meat. You could even survive without vegetables. But lose your grain, and you'd starve before Lent. When it came to vegetables, medieval people turned to the earth itself as a refrigerator. They built root cellars, deep, dark pits dug into cool ground, lined with stones to keep out frost. Carrots, turnips, and parsnips were packed in layers of straw or sand. The air stayed cold but never freezing. In these underground vaults, vegetables could last for months, a hidden treasure buried beneath their homes. Fruit was trickier. Apples and pears were the most common to survive winter, kept in barrels or hung from rafters in cool rooms. Some families dried fruit slices over the fire, creating what we might call medieval chips. Others boiled them into thick, honeyed preserves. Honey, in fact, was another silent savior. Before sugar reached Europe, honey was the sweet binder that preserved fruit, nuts, and even meat. It never spoiled. Archaeologists have found honey thousands of years old, still edible, still golden. For the poorest families, preservation wasn't about stockpiling. It was about rationing. The last crust of bread was hardened, soaked in broth, and shared. Pottage, a kind of thick soup made from whatever was left. Grains, herbs, bits of meat, became the daily meal. It simmered all day over the hearth, never truly finished, just constantly renewed. But storage wasn't just practical. It was spiritual. Every loaf, every barrel of salted meat was tied to faith. The people believed that if they showed gratitude and moderation, God would see them through the frost. In monasteries, monks blessed the cellars before winter, chanting over the barrels of ale and wheels of cheese. These prayers were both hope and insurance, a plea for mercy from a God who had already taken so much. And sometimes, mercy came in strange forms. In some regions, families would hide small charms or crosses in their grain bins, believing they would ward off pests and spoilage. Others buried bones of animals or saints' relics near their root cellars. Science hadn't yet explained fermentation or temperature, so faith filled the gaps. When the snow came, the village grew silent. Paths vanished under drifts, fields turned to white wastelands. Days were short, nights endless. The fires burned low to save wood, children grew thin, and in that stillness, the true test began. Every meal became a calculation. How much to eat? How much to save? The people who survived were not always the strongest, but the most disciplined. And yet, there were moments of warmth, festivals that broke the monotony. At Yule or Christmas, families might open a special jar of preserved meat or all brewed before the frost. It was a celebration not just of Christ but of endurance. Sharing food was proof that they had made it this far. Sometimes, though, even the best prepared village fell victim to a long winter. A thaw delayed, a bad harvest, or a failed salt shipment could bring famine. Chronicles from the 14th century describe people grinding bark into flour, boiling leather, even stealing from church stores. The fear of hunger became its own ghost, one that haunted every meal. But out of that fear came innovation. By the late Middle Ages, villages developed communal granaries, large stone or timber buildings where everyone's grain was stored and guarded. Some even built ice houses, using frozen ponds to keep perishables cool through summer. The seeds of modern food storage were born from those dark winters. As the centuries passed, new techniques, pickling, fermenting, and brewing, transformed survival into culture. Sauerkraut in Germany, kimchi in Korea, salted cod in Scandinavia, all were born from the same human instinct to defy the cold. Imagine now, centuries later, standing in one of those medieval cellars. The air is cool, thick with the smell of earth and thyme. On one side, rows of jars sealed with wax. On the other, smoked meats hanging like ancient relics. It's quiet, almost reverent. Because what you're seeing isn't just food. It's faith turned into matter. It's the memory of thousands who refused to vanish with the frost. Every preserved loaf, every salted fish, every dried apple was a promise that life would return when the sun did. And when spring finally came, when the snow melted and the rivers broke free, the villagers stepped outside, thin but alive. They had outlasted the hunger again. And in that victory, quiet and simple as it was, they found meaning. The medieval world didn't conquer nature.